Happy Friday, and ready for your 3 videos that we'll have for today's lecture series. I will do one video per chapter that you read for this week, chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8. Remember that your most recent paper assignment is based on the content in chapter 8. That assignment has been posted on Moodle, and again, I remind you, if you haven't already looked at it, you will want to, because the assignment requires you to interview 2 family members, um, and so you're going to want to get going on that sooner than later so that you can connect with them to be able to write the paper on the information that you get from those interviews. So if you haven't looked at that, you want to do that ASAP. So um, so also, as I get started with chapter 6 and the experiences of female athletes of color, please respond to my first inquiry forum here, um, and with for the next inquiry forum with the questions I am posing to you right now. First of all, I want to know what you think of the experiences of arguably the best female African American athletes as described in the beginning of chapter 6. Um, what does their experience do for you in terms of providing some context to what other athletes of color might face through their experience playing sports? And then also, which of the films listed on page 98 would be the most interesting for you to view, and why? Which ones are you sort of drawn to? What about the explanation of those videos makes you interested in wanting to see them? If you happen to have seen any of them, I wouldn't mind hearing from you what you've thought of them as well. So let me know if you have actually seen one. That would be great to know as well. So, um, in terms of the experience of women in color in sport, we're going to look at the historical marginalization of women of color, and how it resides in a social construct and a hierarchical traditions of racism, of race, and also of gender, so sexism. And because of that social construct, and that marginalization of these women, oftentimes when you hear the term other, when we're talking about the other, the experience of the other, a lot of times this is how Black women are. This is sort of the category they are placed in: the voice of the other, the experience of the other. Black women fall into that category. Other women of color in general, and other ethnicities fall into that category of other. It's rooted in dominant ideologies and binary categorizations to justify the treatment of people and groups. So for women in color in sport, we know from the research that there's limited opportunities and access to positions of leadership. There's clearly less pay for equal work, and there are decreased rates of sport participation by women, girls, and women of color. Um, the because of those socio-historical realities like racism and sexism, and the systemic processes of white supremacy and the patriarchy, we often find that um, those components isolate and silence female African American athletes, just as well as it does to women and African American women in general. So we're highlighting the sport participation experiences for women in color in the United States of America and abroad a little bit. The chapter covers, and it's beneficial for all women to understand the differential experiences and social realities at the intersection of marginalized race, sex, class, religion, and sexual orientation identities. A delineation of of the experience of female athletes of color serves to exemplify some of the successes and adverse treatment that they experience in their quest to succeed. However, the experience and challenges should not be interpreted as representative of those female athletes of color. So, in other words, and while we do see some positive media coverage of women of color in sports, I mean, obviously, all of you talked about Serena Williams when asked, what are some popular or well-known female athletes that you know of. Um, pretty much all of you talked about Serena Williams, or you have, you can define her as one of the goats of all sport, not just tennis and whatnot. Um, the reality of it is that that is a skewed perspective of what the majority of women of color experience through their relationship to sport and their participation in sport. Um, so we're going to be talking about, what why do women of color have this experience that is seemingly different from white women. Um, and we're going to talk about all of this around and through the idea of the intersectionality theory. Um, that intersectionality theory is a framework that illuminates how forms of discrimination are interrelated and interact, and how that interaction results in multiple and often simultaneous forms of social inequalities. So this is sort of I don't want to call it a buzzword because that's not a totally fair way to describe intersectionality, but it has come to be more popular, or I guess a word or an idea that has been made more aware, people have been made more aware of recently, and I'm talking in the last couple of years, and you may have perhaps have heard about it around the Women's March, because the Women's March that started in the wake of President Trump's inauguration and his going into office of the presidency, it was what happened in reaction to that was a woman. One of the things that's happened in reaction to that is the women's march and the women's movement, the women's march movement, and what people started to recognize with that movement was that it was a lot of white women who were marching, talking about the experience of white women. And the reality of it is that if you're thinking intersectionally, if you're thinking about how the lives intersect of people and their experiences of injustice, we need to include the experiences of Black women, and we need to include the experiences of trans women, and we need to include the experiences of lesbian women, right? So there's not just one female experience. So we're talking about a women's march. We need to be thinking about what is the experience of all women in whatever form that comes to being defined. And so intersectionality talks about how I may be experiencing this and from my vantage point, and the ways that I would describe myself: female, lesbian, parent, mother of children, etc. But I also need to be aware of the fact that there are other people with those similar um, characterizations, but then also have other characterizations that also give them an experience of injustice. And so it's not really appropriate for me to be crying about an injustice in my situation if I'm not thinking about other people's experiences with injustices and fighting for them as well. So the idea here is that when we're talking about intersectionality, we are thinking about where the multiple level and layers of experiences may overlap, how discrimination is interrelated and again, yes, interact, and how that can result in multiple and simultaneous forms of social inequalities and injustices. So typically we look at, in the intersectionality theory, three levels or categorizations of three levels of persons' experiences: structural, political, and representational. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those a little bit later on in the lecture, and they come up again later in the slideshow. So Let's talk about the sporting experiences of women of color. In the United States, women of color have a history of sport participation. However, um, because of their intersectionality, the single axis look at data and the way that we look at um, sports participation, not considering race as a separate category, and then a scholarship and research and literature. We haven't clearly really defined what the setbacks have been, um, and so we don't really know the total breadth of issue with the participation by colored women, um, and but we're starting to really unveil what that looks like. And a big part of this is the whole single axis discrimination. It's problematic when you're only looking at sort of one angle. So if you're only saying when you're saying all women, but you're not breaking it down by race, then it's hard to really say that you are understanding what the experience of Black women are, versus just women in general, right? So when you're talking about single access discrimination, it's impossible to separate racial oppression from gender discrimination because they're experienced simultaneously. And so while you can say like women didn't have equal opportunity, we had Title IX, and now women have better opportunity, more equitable opportunity. That isn't really all women's experiences because there are still some prejudices that are based on race that Title IX can't address because Title IX only talks about sex discrimination. So that single access discrimination is difficult for us to fully comprehend and get to the bottom of how we resolve some of these issues of the participation experience by colored women, or women of color, and yeah, and so that's a little bit of like why we are starting to come in now. We're starting to realize because we're starting to get some of this data that's really exploiting the issue that we have around the participation levels of women of color. So, for example, less than 25% of female collegiate athletes in Division One, Two, and Three are considered women of color. That is a very small amount. I mean, there are a lot of women today that are college athletes, and it is wild for me to think that only a quarter of them, are considered women of color. So that we're missing out on a huge population, section of our population, right? And women, when we do see women of color participating in collegiate sports, they are mostly categorized in the sport of basketball and the sports of track and field. So anyway, I want to go back to my 25% women of color. It's actually less than 25%. It's actually closer to 20% participation by collegiate athletes. Sorry, I always because I put less than 25% on your slide, that number, like, I always just say 25%, but it's actually more like 20%. So it hovers just north of 20%. And when we break it down by sport, basketball, we see of those women that are considered of color, women of color participating in college sports, just south of 60% of them are basketball athletes, and about 35% of them are track and field athletes. So that only leaves like 5% of those women of color participating in all the other sports. That's really wild to think of. Like, legitimately, that's sort of like a wow moment when you think about all the different sports that women can participate in college, right? From volleyball to softball, lacrosse, field hockey, soccer, swimming and diving, tennis, golf. Right? The list kind of just goes on. And so it's quite an eye opener to think about the fact that when we look at the college sport experience for women of color, it is pretty pinpointed where basketball or where the women are gravitating to, and that is basketball and track and field. Um, and what again when we come to this sort of idea of how we create more opportunity for women when we're thinking about equity and we're thinking about Title IX, again, we're thinking about women in general, and so the NCAA, they have been doing a really good job over the last decade and a half or a couple decades in supporting and encouraging schools to sponsor what we would call emerging sports. So, like the growing sports for girls to have to participate in. Those have been sports like lacrosse, triathlon, bowling, hockey. These are the sports that have been sort of emerging sports for women. Um, Water polo, sand volleyball. So, right, these are sports that the NCAA has really encouraged institutions to add in order to help the gap that they may be experiencing with Title IX compliance, and also just to grow and encourage participation by girls. Well, again, when we think about those types of sports, a lot of those sports are not sports that are going to be a huge gateway for girls of color to participate in. And so what we see is that while the NCAA is trying to encourage these emerging sports um, for institutions to implement, the increases have primarily been witnessed by white women. I mean, by and large, that's what we have seen. So it hasn't been super successful to just rely on what the NCAA has been encouraging as emerging sports, because it doesn't seem to really capture the women of color and what would maybe pull them in to participate in. Um, so the participation numbers that we know of, the baseline data that we do know of, demonstrate clear segregated participation patterns for women of color. So what contributes to these inequities? How is this happening? Well, as your book states, continuing racism and the disparate impacts of economic inequality on populations of color contribute to this, right? When you have continued racism and you have continued disparate impact on economic inequality on populations of color, you have less access to opportunity. The inequitable representation of female athletes of color in certain sports has been oftentimes attributed to socialization, inequitable educational opportunities, lack of role models in the playing at the playing level, and in athletic leadership positions. So when you don't see or have mentors that look like you, it's hard to pursue a dream to do what you maybe feel compelled or passionate towards. Um, when you don't have women of color in leadership positions, you don't have them have a voice at the table. They can't make decisions that make sense for the demographic that you're trying to expand opportunity to, right? So, for instance, in the last census in 2015 of the race of athletic directors, only 8 athletic directors at the Division One NCAA Division One level were identified as women of color. Only 8, and so when we're talking about um, hundreds of schools that are Division One in the Division One um, level, like this is a very small number, right? Um, and 10 and 9 women at the Division 2 and the Division 3 level, respectively, right? So you're talking about 8, 10, 18, and then 9, 27 total women of color and the highest level of decision making at the athletic director role in intercollegiate athletics in the NCAA. That's a very minuscule amount, tiny. That's very teeny tiny, right? So there's not a loud voice for women of color, again, to make decisions that would make sense for that demographic, for that population. Um, and then as you go down sort of the leadership chain, only approximately 14% of head coaches of women's teams at all NCAA divisions are women of color. So it's hard. It's hard when you don't see that representation that looks like you. It's hard to think about how you can pursue an experience in that area, right? So this is why the Simone Biles, the Gabby Douglases, this is why their notoriety is so significant, because you are showing young Black girls that they can be gymnasts too. They can be excellent and excel at the sport of gymnastics, where previously it was pretty much predominantly white. And so it was hard for them to see themselves as potential gymnasts until they saw Gabby Douglas win the gold in London 2012, and then Simone Biles just totally dominate in Rio the way that she has, and has since in all the world championships done the same. And so this is, these are important moments in sport, but we need them to sustain, because we need girls to see that, and many generations of girls to see that success happen. And so we need to make that gateway possible for women of color to walk through. So that low representation of women of color as role models and mentors, it has far-reaching consequences, more than we might think about, in terms of developing future female players and leaders. So hence, to address that participation inequalities in sport, we have to address inequities in leadership at the youth level, the interscholastic level, high school, junior high, high school level, and the college levels. And also we have to think about too, like, media coverage of highly successful female athletes of color give a perception of high participation rate, but that's also disproportionate to the actual experience, right? So I kind of already addressed that at the beginning, but again, I want to circle back to that point, because it is very true. So we do know that other, like, big barriers to participation and representation are socioeconomic challenges, stereotyping, and then cultural barriers. The racial history, so socioeconomic challenges. We can look at, like, the racial history characterized by oppression and servitude in the United States and many countries abroad. So we have race and class that are inextricably intertwined. And they have, so as such, we see that people of color have a higher representation in lower socioeconomic classes due to the racial categorization. Um, and the one of the researchers that your book talks about, the Sabo and Velez analysis, they found that in general, participation rates increased for children residing in households with higher income levels. But for girls of color, there's a decline in participation and a stark disparity when compared to white boys, white girls, and boys of color. And there's a text in your book, the 6.1 text in your book, that's interesting to look at, because it talks about that data. And so I think when you get a chance, if you haven't looked at it closely, you should look at it and see how that correlation matches up. And then lastly, a lot of the sports being offered happening are being recruited out of private clubs, and it doesn't, and so that not only limits exposure to diverse sport opportunities, but it decreases scholarship opportunities that would allow female athletes of color to compete at higher levels of sport. So the socioeconomic challenges are abundant. And of course, stereotypes, I mean, that is always a barrier for participation by girls in a wide variety. And so for women of color, girls of color, when we're talking about stereotypes, they the stereotypes around sport, especially, right, because it's heteronormative. There's the hegemonic notions of race and gender when it comes to how we think about women's experience in sport versus the men's experience of sport. And these can have the sort of hegemonic notion of race and gender can have a profound influence on how women of color are socialized in society by their parents, by the media, schools, other institutional environments, when it comes to the context of sport. And so women of color definitely face an additional challenge to participate in sport due to this hegemonic and culturally specific gender roles that exist, that undergird the stereotypes that we typically see for women. So, what we typically would see is that, a general stereotype is that feminine sports exude delicacy, aesthetic, pleasingly aesthetic experiences. I sort of lost my my notes here. Hold on, sorry. um, sorry, artistry, right? So we're talking about, like, of course we think about the female experience should be around gymnastics, synchronized swimming, swimming in general, dance. These are the things that we sort of, these categorizations often are how we think about the female experience in sport. But they also are more expensive because they required specialized coaching, expensive equipment, or facilities that are not just like, go out in your backyard and practice, or out on your front driveway. And so, you know, so what we see is that, of course, often you see these experiences being supported in more sort of suburban areas, right? And when you, in sort of high, more affluent areas, and when you have that, you have lower representation of racial and ethnic minorities. That's just typical in our country. That's the way it works more often than not. So additionally, the institution of sport, prevalent stereotypes about African Americans having innate running and jumping abilities have been identified as reasons why African American women are overrepresented in the sports like basketball and track and field. So we understand that what is typically a female stereotyped sport, what are typically female stereotyped sports, that excludes African American women for a variety of reasons, because um, it's not as accessible for them to participate in, socioeconomically, but also it doesn't cater to their sort of genetic predisposition of what they do well skill wise, right? Like the sport of like basketball and track and field might. And so this is how we start to see how they kind of get wormholed into a certain type of sport or experience with sport, and how we see that impacting the stereotype that we think about when we think about athletes and athletes in certain types of sports, how we start to see that it becomes um, more normal to see African Americans in the sport of basketball versus the sport of softball or the sport of volleyball. To me, I feel like we should see more African Americans in the sport of volleyball, because what we think of as their strength and athleticism is really represented in the sport of basketball. So it is really shocking to me, but I think the club system of volleyball has precluded this demographic from participating in volleyball at the younger levels, and so it sort of creates a barrier for them to participate it when they become a little bit older. And then cultural barriers can be vast. While we're talking primarily about the black woman's experience, cultural barriers, especially for sort of like Hispanic and Native American women, they tend to come from homes where the cultural traditions dictate that they stay at home and help with the family. That's what women do. It's really more like, our ancient cultures that we studied at the beginning of the semester tell us that how women tend to, the roles that they tend to fall into. And so, anyway, we also see, like, there's other cultural barriers for some other cultures, like Asian countries, sort of these lingering Confucian beliefs, sort of have women as a sort of inferior to men, and it's remained influential. So, it limits women's participation unless they're under sort of the conventional patriarchal control of a male, or of a coach, right? So, if they've been identified as a potential star athlete, then they have to be under the watchful eye of a male coach. That's sort of that lingering belief system from the Confucian way of thinking. And then, of course, Muslim women also, from various races, the experience that they seek to have in sport is really against a lot of the beliefs and a lot of Muslim communities. Now, not all, like Muslims are not homogenous. There is a vast variety of Muslim way of living, and so there's definitely people that live the Muslim life that's different politically, linguistically, economically, and socioeconomically. So women's experiences, if they're Muslim, are also very different. Their challenges in sport can be very different. So in countries such as like Iran and Oman and Saudi Arabia, they still live under Sharia law, right? So they it severely hinders their experiences. They still kind of have this idea that women can't even be present at sporting events, right? This is how oppressed these women are in these cultures. But of course, there are other Muslim cultures where women can participate in sport. A lot of times, it still means they have to be under the watchful eye of males, or they could participate if it sort of falls in line with Sharia law. But the fact of the matter is that the Muslim experience also creates a level of oppression for women to participate in sport, but it isn't consistent. It's very across the board. Um, so scholars and advisors suggest, right, that we have a sort of multi-level approach to how we eradicate the inequitable experiences and factors that women of color face in terms of the barriers. And so they believe that we need to come up with a clear baseline set of data so that we know exactly what we're up against, what is creating these distinctions in participation rates. We need to have some grassroots efforts. We need to have financial support going into these grassroots efforts, and then we need to have social support, right? So definitely, the grassroots efforts can happen in communities at the local level. They can serve as political gestures aimed at addressing groups that have been marginalized and overlooked. Um, Grassroots efforts require resources such as money. So, of course, the Women's Sports Foundation really encourages current organizations and associations that provide grants and financial aid assistance to address the issues of racial and color inequities in sport. Um, and they really encourage people to sponsor and or create scholarship opportunities for women of color, girls of color, so we can get their participation levels up. And there's, a number of organizations that are already trying to do this. For example, the Black Women in Sport Foundation, the BWSF, they were founded in 1992, and they're a nonprofit that is dedicated to increasing the involvement of Black women and girls in sports, any aspect of sport, so athletics, participation in athletics, coaching, administration. The Black Women's Sports Foundation is really doing their part to try to help encourage financial support, social support for women of color, and to get that broader experience. So other things that we can create in terms of intersectionality and opportunities for women of color. When we're talking about political intersectionality, in addition to promoting efforts of recruitment and employment of women of color in sport, there's just a need to promote the engagement and representation of women of color serving on committees, right? So that they're on hiring committees, that they're on standing committees, that they're on governance committees. If you're working in in a school and you have like sort of these hiring committees or search committees, you need to have diverse representation on those committees, because again, you're gonna create the ability to create a more diverse pool of applicants, because you've got a wide variety of diverse opinions around the table looking at the potential applicants. If you have standing committees and you don't have a diverse group of voices making decisions for a committee that meets on a regular basis, then you're going to have a very, you know, you sort of like very individual, very single very single focused experience through what that committee represents. So it's and certainly governance too, right? Like you really need a diverse group of voices in governance, right? So just like in the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, recognizing like we're not diverse enough, we don't have enough diverse voices to make smart decisions about how to be inclusive in the games, right? How we make the games inclusive to our participants, if we don't have people who can like look at what the experience is like for those for the voice of the other, right? The experience of the other. So membership on committees can really help ensure that plans and programs serve the interest of women of color. As participants, staff, coaches, administrators can also promote and practice inclusive environments and inclusive excellence. So we want to make sure that we're putting women of color in, we want to recruit them to employ them, and we want to make sure that once we do that, we also put them on committees to represent that diverse perspective. And then in terms of representational intersectionality, how we can create a positive experience for women of color. We want to make sure that we're thinking about positive portrayals of women in the media and role models of women in color in various sports. So not just basketball, not just track and field, but yes, we've had tennis for a long-standing time with the Williams sisters, and now Sloane Stevens too. And there's also this 15-year-old, phenom that has qualified for Wimbledon. That's also an African American woman, and so that sport has definitely had its share of women of color, representation. But other sports, we need other sports. So like I was saying earlier, volleyball, we need softball. Sports like what we would traditionally think of country club sports, like swimming and golf and lacrosse, soccer, all these sports. We need more women of color to represent on those sporting teams. And then, we need to think about we need to combat the barrier of negative portrayals of Black women, right? Like such as the angry Black woman, right? We need to think about how we lessen that stereotype through familiarity and understanding, and think about how we can portray positive images and narratives of Black women. Even just think about like Serena Williams and her portrayal in the media, really over the last couple of years, especially. But it really her coverage in the media is really heightened when she goes through sort of some really negative experiences, and particularly when she throws fits on the court, and they always really overemphasize her experience in a match when she's gotten riled up about something, and they're always using words that are more negative in how they describe, the more negative adjectives about how they describe her behavior and her outbursts, versus, and there's been research done on this, right? Like this has actually been researched versus when a male tennis player has a similar type of outburst on the tennis court. Is it's impassioned, it's confident, it's like it's much more shed in a positive light, and so it's really interesting to see the times when we've seen big headlines on Serena in the last couple years. They have been more negative types of stories about how she's handled a situation, or that she got herself in this situation or that bind, or what have you, instead of really looking at how she's how far she's come. You all don't know her from when she was a teenager and came on the pro circuit, but I have literally watched her grow up in the tennis, in the professional tennis world, and the way she has changed and matured, and now how she's really trying to fight for women's experiences, and then mothers, who are trying to be working mothers. She's doing a phenomenal job, and she's a business entrepreneur. She's a very successful woman, and a powerful woman, and a powerful woman of color that we need to uplift, because she is a wonderful symbol of what literally hard work, right? A kid from Compton who made herself her own name. Like, she is Serena. Everyone knows who Serena is, and that's a magical touch that she's got. And it's great for young girls of color to see what Serena been able to do with her life. So we need to be thinking about continuing positive media coverage. And so just looking ahead in general, to advance women of color in sport, we got to be thinking about grassroots efforts. We got to be thinking about resources and, supporting them. We need to have individuals in positions of power to bring about decisions, policy changes, practices that need to be addressed, particularly around the low rates of female athletes of color participating in non-traditional sports, right? So not basketball, not track and field, but sort of all the other sports, and really even more so the very kind of non-traditional sports. We need to address the limited number of staff, coaches, administrators, because without them sort of being images that young girls of color can look up to, they don't know that they can aspire to be more a part of sport more than beyond maybe a youth level of participation. And again, just all the different types of representation of women and of color in the media. We need to have much more positive representation overall. So these are the things that need to be addressed by women in positions that reflect the representation that is low in women of color and their experiences in sport. Don't forget about the questions I asked at the beginning. Make sure if you forgot those, go back and listen in the first couple minutes of the video, and pay attention for others that'll come up in the next video and the third video as well.